Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to Sayville Library and our discussion with local author Theresa Dodaro this evening, covering the theme of war across Theresa's novels. She's a very well-accomplished local author. We just finished up a program at the end of October at Meadowcroft, right here in Sayville, one of the Roosevelt estates. And that is the setting in Bayman's Daughter, one of Theresa's novels. And the fact that we just celebrated Veterans Day this month sparked an interest in me to talk to Theresa about why she's included war in her novels, etc., and why soldiers, and what about the soldiers, etc., etc. So I'm happy to have Theresa this evening. She will be primarily conducting the discussion. I'll jump in with a couple of questions if the discussion suits. And as you all, the rest of our audience here, have thoughts that are sparked as Theresa's talking about these themes in her novels, and a little bit about the novels themselves, I'm sure she'll get to, feel free to jump in and ask a question. So welcome, everyone. And if I haven't already said so, I'm Jonathan Pryor. I'm the head of community outreach here at Sayville Library. So welcome, and a special welcome to Theresa Dodaro, our local author. Theresa, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Yeah, The Bayman's Daughter is my fifth novel. It all started with The Tin Box Secret, and that book was published in 2015. The reason that book had the Vietnam War in it was because my oldest brother was in Vietnam at the time. And I was probably about 7 or 8 years old when he was there. And you know, you didn't have cell phones and computers, so you didn't know what was happening at the time. The only way you would know anything was by the news on the radio or on TV, and an occasional letter. So it was really scary being a child and listening to the news reports on the radio and on TV, and just not knowing if he was okay. As it turned out, he spent his time in Da Nang and hadn't really seen much of, he wasn't walking through rice paddies. So, thankfully he came home safe, but that didn't mean that I wasn't worried about him and that our family wasn't worried about him when he was there. And so that is what started with The Tin Box Secret, was the feeling. What was the family feeling? War goes beyond the soldiers. It's not only them, it's the family, and it's also the people that get caught up in the war because they live wherever the battle is being fought. So again, The Tin Box Secret is sort of a story of me going back to my own childhood and rewriting some things the way I wish they could have happened. It was very cathartic for me to write that book, but the war part of it, it was in The Tin Box Secret, there's portions where, the little girl is saying that she's seen movies where the Native Americans come through and they die, and then, they're shot and they're killed. And my father told me that, and the father in the book tells the little girl that they just run behind the camera and they come back. They're actors. They're not really dead, because it was really scary to think in Vietnam people were being shot and killed. And so that's what I correlated it with, was TV movies, movies about the old Westerns and wars and fights and battles. So the Tin Box Secret isn't a lot about the war itself. There's one friend of the main character whose brother dies in the war in Vietnam. And again, it deals with what's happening at home and that loss of her brother. But that's mostly The Tin Box Secret. And then in the third book in the trilogy, Reawakening, it's the 1970s. So you deal with Nixon ending the war and what happens, and it just going through the details of what actually happened and the timeline of when it all happened. So some people may not be clear about that. Some people who live through it remember it, and other people who didn't live through it, it will introduce them to what happened and how it happened and how it all unfolded. The Hope Chest is the second book in the trilogy. And in that book, the main character, Juliana, falls into a coma and lives through her previous life during the Civil War. I knew a lot about Gettysburg, but I didn't know a lot about Vicksburg. And my friends live in Mississippi, and we went to visit them, and we went to Vicksburg and to a museum. And I bought this book there. Let's see if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, this is the people of Vicksburg lived through a siege that lasted from April and ended on the 4th of July, the same time that Gettysburg was happening, so 1863. What had happened was that New Orleans had fallen, and the Union Army wanted access of the Mississippi River to get down to New Orleans, to send supplies down, people down, whatever, soldiers down, without having to go all the way around the country. And the only thing that stood in the way was Vicksburg.
Huh.
So they surrounded Vicksburg because they couldn't conquer it. So they surrounded it. And for 3 months, people starved. And they moved out of their homes and into caves because there was this constant bombardment of artillery from the river and from the land around them. So they moved and lived in these caves. And this book is the actual stories from the people who lived through it, telling you what happened. So this book was invaluable in my research for the Hope Chest, which is this book. So the story there is there's a girl, and she is about 16, and she has to move into these caves, and she ends up losing a lot of her family, and she has to do some pretty horrendous things in order to take care of her younger siblings. And it's just, this is what war is like. When the thing is, it doesn't matter what side it is, it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, people get caught up in it. They live there, and children suffer, people suffer because they are where the war is happening. And it's, I just think it could happen here. It could happen anywhere. What would I do to save my children? You know, what would I do to protect my neighbors and my friends and my family? And when you read what other people have been through in other parts of the world, through other wars, you get to understand it a little bit better, you know, rather than judging people for what they did or didn't do. And that was what I really found interesting in the Hope Chest. And then we have the Porcelain Doll, which is my favorite book of mine. And by the way, my daughter does my covers. But the Porcelain Doll was inspired by 2 women, one who is beloved in Sayville, Regina Ports, and she was a young child during World War II, somewhere on the Eastern Front of the war in Germany. And she's passed away. So there are still questions I wish I could ask her that I can't anymore, but I'm thankful that I did ask her the questions I did. She had a porcelain doll, and it was broken during the war. Her father was the Burgermeister, and which is the mayor, and he also had a little guest house, and she was supposed to be watching in case somebody came in and needed a room. And she left her post and went to a friend's house with her doll. And when her father came back and found her missing, he found her at her friend's house, and he was so angry, he took the doll and he dropped it and it cracked. And they weren't able to fix it because all of the factories were making ammunition. They weren't fixing dolls. So her story at the end of the war, where her house was, became the property of the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet army was marching in, they became refugees. And she told us stories about how she would, her family would survive by digging down and taking one potato from a farm so that the farmer wouldn't know, and that was food for the whole family. Or her brother shot a crow with a slingshot, and that was food for 3 nights for the family. It was incredible stories. And I always felt like there was, I needed to put this into a story because it explained what people were living through who lived in Germany, or a German country at that time that was under the control of the Nazis, and didn't necessarily believe one thing or another, but they suffered anyway. And I think that it's not often told. Now, there is a book called Death in the Baltic by Catherine Prince, and it tells about the Wilhelm Gustloff. And when I asked people what was the greatest maritime disaster during war, no one can tell me. They usually say it's, regardless of being war, that it's Titanic, but it's not. It's the Wilhelm Gustloff. And let me just read the back of this to give you an idea. In the final days of World War II, German civilians were in a panic. The Third Reich was in free fall, and the Allied forces were closing in from all directions. With the Red Army quickly advancing from the east, Berlin planned an 11th hour exodus for upwards of 10,000 women, children, and the elderly, using a former cruise ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Sent off into the icy waters of the Baltic Sea on January 30th, 1945, they were soon found and fired upon by the Soviet Navy submarines. The ship sank that night, taking an estimated 9,400 victims to their deaths, 6 times the number lost in the Titanic. Yet despite the magnitude of this disaster, both East and West kept this story hidden for nearly 70 years. I saw a program on YouTube where the survivors, who had been children at the time, took a ship back to the place where the Wilhelm Gustloff sunk and threw wreaths into the water. And they cried and they said, why do people not know about this story, that this happened? So that story is also woven into the Porcelain Doll.
Wow.
Because I found it so amazing that people didn't know. 5,000 of that 9,400, whatever it was, people were children. And they died, they perished. They were innocent, they were not soldiers. There were soldiers, there were Nazis on the ship, but overwhelmingly, they were innocent people on the ship. So it's an important part of the Porcelain Doll. The Porcelain Doll also has another character. Well, the main character, Issy, is representative of Regina Ports, but there's another character, Rebecca, and a friend of mine, her mother was a hidden child during the war. She lived in Hungary, and her grandparents lived in Czechoslovakia. And I spoke with her for several hours on the phone. And when I was done, she said to me, "You're not going to use my name, are you?" And I thought, she's still afraid. She's still a hidden child, even though she's 85 years old now. And that was several years ago. But in her case, what actually happened was that when the Nazis came to take her grandparents away, her grandmother gave her gold wedding band to a neighbor with a note, and the wedding band was in payment. to entice the neighbor to actually get the note to her son in Hungary. And she never knew that that note made it because she died in a concentration camp. But it did make it. And it said, "They have come for us. Surely they are taking us to our deaths. Save the children." And the two little girls were hidden in a convent. The family did survive, and then in the 1950s, during the Hungarian Revolution, Erica left Hungary and she crossed the border. She took a train as far as she could, and then she had to cross the border on foot, and people were shooting at her. And she kept walking and walking and walking. She was walking to a sister convent, I believe in Austria, to the one that had saved her and hidden her. And by the time she got there, her feet were bleeding and everything that she had been through, she was starving. She got there and they helped her get passage to America. And then she said to me, when I got to America and to my aunt's house, my aunt never treated me right. And I never told my parents this. I never told my mother, but my aunt didn't treat me right because I had spent that time in the concentration camp, I wasn't Jewish enough. And this, I mean, how hard could that possibly be for this child? I mean, she's at this point a teenager, but it's really what she went through is awful. But these are real stories about real people during the war. I weave these stories into my stories because I think that through that emotion of getting to know these characters and see what they live through and what they have to go through, then we can feel, some empathy toward these people who maybe they're on the wrong side of the war, maybe whatever, but they are people caught up in this. In fact, in the story, Rebecca, her father survives a work camp, as did Erica's father, but he does things there where he actually aids the Nazis at times in order for him to survive. And that is really hard for him to live with. But there are times when people are prisoners or whatever, and they might have to do whatever they have to do to survive. And so that is part of the story. I don't say that that's what Erica's father did, but in the story, that's what Rebecca's father does. So again, to me, it's knowing the little known stories and trying to understand, because war helps us understand what the values are of at a time period. It helps us understand the times through what weapons are available, through what medical help is available for people, and through why was the war or battle fought. Was it religion? Was it land? Was it power? Was it an injustice to a group of people? This tells us a lot about that time period. Also, what happens after that war? Are there any reparations? Is that the right correct word made? Is land given away? Are things changed or are they not changed after the war? Viewing that is also important to understand the war and what happened and the people who lived at that time. I really do feel that people, no matter where or when, people just want the same things. They want to have peace and happiness and a chance to live their lives. And it doesn't really matter when it is, or where it is, it's always the same thing. So it's easy to understand how they're feeling, because I don't think it would be any different than how I would feel if I was in that situation. Then of course we have The Bayman's Daughter, which, wow, let me tell you, my 5th novel, it's finally gotten there. Yay! I was fascinated by Camp Upton and the things that I learned about that Irving Berlin was there, that he wrote God Bless America there, and oh, how I hate to get up in the morning there. I found it very interesting that this group of young soldiers that came out of Camp Upton, who were made up of boys from Long Island and boys from what they called the 5 Points in New York, in Manhattan, in New York City. In these people who came, these boys who came from the city, they were all gang kids. From there were the Irish kids and the Italian kids and whatever it was. They were different nationalities, and they all lived on these 5 points, and they came together and they did battle. But when they came to Fort Upton, they became a united group, and they became part of the Lost Battalion during World War I. Do you all know? Have you heard of the Lost Battalion?
No.
I have not. I have not.
No.
Okay. Well, I'd like to read some from that, if you don't mind, because I found these boys fascinating. Once in France, at the battalion aid post, Philip and Harold were assigned to accompany the 308th on part of what was being called the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The dense Argonne forest in northeastern France was a place where the Germans were heavily entrenched, and it was their job to push through the German front line to reach a critical railway junction near Sedan. The junction was being used by the Germans to bring fresh supplies to almost the entire German army. If they could capture this junction, it would inflict a devastating blow to the enemy. Major Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Division would be their leader. On the early morning of September 26, 1918, 600,000 American soldiers stretching for miles between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest began their mission. 600 of those men followed Major Whittlesey into the forest, expecting the French to cover them from their left flank. Leaving the comparative safety of their base camp, Philip and Harold, who are both fictional characters, held on to their medical equipment with the fierceness that comes from finally being able to do what they had been trained long and hard for. The men around them had been with them at Camp Upton. The same tough New York City former gang members were street trained and ready to prove themselves in battle. What they lacked in real wartime experience, they made up for in grit. It wasn't long before what had been the distant roar of artillery engulfed them. First, they crossed the battlefield. Pits filled with dirty rainwater and blood alternated with muddy, barren hills. Barbed wire crisscrossed the landscape and prevented them from moving quickly. Philip's knuckles turned white as his hands clasped his bayoneted rifle. Shells whistled far overhead in both directions. Harold looked at him with frightened eyes as the mud slowed him down. The mud was like quicksand. It could swallow a man whole. In fact, dead bodies littered the area known as no man's land, half hidden in the thick mud. Philip encouraged, "A few yards, that's all we need to go, and then a few yards more. Just keep moving forward." Harold nodded, but didn't say a word. Finally, they entered the dense trees of the forest. Their progress was slowed by the fallen leaves, sticks, and branches on the ground. The rain started and quickly increased in intensity. They inched forward. It wasn't long before they came under direct fire. The men around them were hit by bullets, and Philip hurried to save them as they called out desperately, "First aid." There were many casualties, and Major Whittlesey radioed to let General Alexander know they were taking on heavy fire, but he was ordered to keep going forward. So the men walked into the barrage of gunfire. As they fired back, Harold called out, "You dirty krauts!" After hours of pressing on, finally they reached their mark, the Chalvier Mill area. The Germans were entrenched just yards away from them, hidden by the forest. As it turned out, a German sniper quickly had them in his sight, and one by one picked off the Americans over the next grueling couple of days. With the radio communication lines cut between Whittlesey's men and base camp, the major ordered the men to send a pigeon home with their coordinates. They were now out of both food and water, but they couldn't get to a stream without the sniper opening fire on them. They finally knew that the pigeon had made it to base camp once the American artillery started to fly through the air. For a moment, they thought they were saved, but soon it became apparent that had been a mistake made. Instead of hitting the Germans, the shells were raining down on what was left of Major Whittlesey's men. In desperation, another pigeon was sent, telling base camp of the error and pleading with them to stop the barrage of the artillery. A sniper shot the pigeon in the air, but somehow it continued to fly. Miraculously, it made it back to base camp. Philip wondered how the soldiers behind the heavy guns of artillery took the news that they had been firing on their own soldiers. But after hours upon hours of heavy losses, the shelling finally ceased. In the quiet that followed, Philip and Harold did what they could to tie off severed limbs, bind up wounds, and triage their brothers in arms. The woods began to stink of rotting flesh, and the men's cries, moans, and coughs quickly filled the silence. Philip tied a handkerchief across his mouth and nose and felt the fevered foreheads of the coughing soldiers. It was clear to him that there was also another enemy afoot, influenza. He said out loud, "Stilts," that's what he calls Harold, "Stilts. The wounded and sick need help, need water now." Harold responded, "I'll go." Harold collected empty canteens and scurried down the tree-covered hill to the stream below, holding a white flag above his head. He had just made it to the stream when a shot rang out and Harold fell, lifeless, to the ground. The canteens jingled like bells as they hit against the rocks and then floated away on the stream. Philip cried out, "Stilts!" but there was nothing he could do. The men slept when they could. 5 days had passed since they left base camp. Suddenly, the sound of an aeroplane could be heard above. The men cheered as they saw it was their own. The pilot was trying to find the lost battalion. Upon sighting them, he rolled his plane from side to side, signaling to the men on the ground that they had been found. Hope spread through the camp that reinforcements were finally on their way. However, the rolling of the aeroplane's wings had also grabbed the attention of the Germans. Shots rang out as the pilot was hit. The plane sputtered away, barely under control of the wounded pilot. The men waited. Piercing the silence came a terrible sound. German soldiers approached them, armed with flamethrowers. Blood-curdling screams came from the men as they were engulfed in fire. Still, they did not retreat from the onslaught. Instead, the gritty city boys ran toward it. The Germans had obviously never encountered men like these before. The streetwise 308th charged their enemy and, grabbing hold of the flamethrowers, turned them against the Germans. The German soldiers fled in retreat. Philip attended to the men whose skin had been seared off by the flames. Their pain was unbearable, and there was little Philip could do to alleviate it. While attending to one young man whose red hair reminded him of Hannah and Harry, gunfire erupted above his head. One of the bullets entered his patient's head, and the young man's body fell backward to the ground. Before Philip had a chance to react, another bullet whizzed through the air, and Philip felt it a burning sensation as it passed through the muscle in his own thigh. He collapsed into the bloody mud. The pain was excruciating, but he had the presence of mind to take a piece of material from his medic pack and tie it above the injury. Then he opened the last half-empty bottle of antibiotics, and swallowed one pill before he passed out. Well, there's this whole, that's a whole nother story. How he has antibiotics. It's because he's gone back from the future, Okay. On the sixth day, a medical unit made its way to the trapped men and began the task of carrying the wounded and dead out through the forest. They had become known at base camp as the Lost Battalion. There were so many wounded that the men of the regimental band were pressed into service as litter bearers. It took 36 hours for the ambulance companies and volunteer riflemen from the regiment to bring the wounded out, each trip taking 12 hours. Some of the men pressed into this service were of slender physique, yet upon arriving at the opening to the forest, faint and exhausted, they only took a short respite before returning with empty litters and more medical supplies. Philip was eventually transferred to a field hospital. The last of the antibiotics that his parents had sent with him were now gone. Out of the 600 men that Major Whittlesey marched into the forest, only 194 men walked out on their own power. 600,000 Americans began the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Over the next 6 weeks, a total of more than 1.2 million American soldiers in 22 divisions assaulted the German positions in northeastern France. By the time of the armistice, more than 120,000 American soldiers were wounded and 26,277 had died in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which had spanned from September 26th to November 11th. Because of them, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the war was finally over. What do you think, Jonathan?
So this was from Bayman's daughter that you were just reading?
Yes.
So, we have a few questions in chat. I'm going to get to those, but, I think one of the things that strikes me is the human side of war that you seek to portray in your novels. So there's very much, it's not so much dwelling on the political aspect of who was fighting on what side, but rather the intensity of human suffering and conflict. That seems to be what comes through, at least on my end. The very
that is my intention, is to examine war. I mean, certainly wars, I don't believe will ever stop. But
no.
If we understand the loss, perhaps there can be more empathy toward people who suffer during war. And I again, this story, this is true, and there is detailed documents online that you can find of what happened to these people during of the Lost Battalion, hour by hour, what they went through, their account of what happened. And that is what I used when I did this, when I wrote this. But I had never heard of them before. And I didn't know a lot about World War I at all. I knew a lot about World War II. But again, I discovered things about World War II I didn't know, like there was a submarine right outside of, Long Island, and dropping off Germans on Amagansett shore, and that they were going to blow up Penn Station. There's a lot, we think that the war happened somewhere else, but really there were people here ready to take us down. The kids in Sayville were standing on top of old 88 watching the water and to see if they could find a submarine. We were all, they did what they could to collect rubber and metals and whatever to help the soldiers. And So there was a lot going on. That is all caught up too in this story of, you know, what was going on at home. So I hope that through reading my novels, people look these things up and learn more about them and discover that there are a lot of things that happened in wars that we are familiar with that we don't know about. And it's very interesting to see different perspectives.
Absolutely. You know, along those lines, Valerie Nafora has a question for us. She's asking, where do you find your inspiration?
Oh, you know, my inspiration for the war stories or just for what I'm writing? Because my
just in general, like even the Bayman's daughter, the like where did I remember when you started writing that story a few years ago. Where do these things come to you? Do they start as a dream? Do they start as a conversation? Where does your inspiration come from?
Well, there was a Bayman who lived in my house. His name during World War I and before World War I, and his name was Andrew Tuthill. I changed his name to Andrew Trumbull and gave him a fictional family. I just could imagine somebody being in my house at that time and what was happening in the world, you know. And then you have, I live very close to Meadowcroft, and I have always found Meadowcroft to be fascinating. It's like a time capsule walking through it. My daughter did play the Roosevelt piano during the Christmas open houses years ago, and I just found it just so interesting. And as I started doing my research, I found so much information. And, you know, the fact that that John Ellis Roosevelt's oldest daughter, Pansy, gets taken away, gets, you know, sent to a sanitarium. She starts out in January of 1902 as being one of the most desirable debutantes in the world. And by October, she's in a sanitarium in Whitestone. And no one knows what was wrong with Pansy, but I can only imagine it was an emotional thing, that maybe it was anxiety, depression, you know, something like that. So I just try to get into the real people and the characters and try to understand what happened. And after that, she's like never spoken about anymore. Whenever John Ellis Roosevelt is mentioned, so he's mentioned with having two daughters. They don't mention Pansy. And you know, a lot of people say it reminds them of Rosemary Kennedy and how she was hidden away. So it's you start learning about the time and the real people, and you get so caught up in what happened to them. But when you're writing about real people, you have to be respectful that there are descendants of them alive. And so what you choose to write about, how you choose to write about them, can limit a story. And so you invite fictional characters and you can do anything you want to them. And then you can really get the story going to keep people interested, to turn the page. They're learning history, but what's keeping them going is the story. And you can do, again, anything you want to fictional people, and it's okay. But
so would you say therefore that the story finds you? You don't go looking for the story? Like in all your 5 novels, did it just appear to you one day, or did it? Because I know you and I have talked about this, right? Because we're both Cancers.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Right. Well, that's what I was just going to say. For Valerie is a writer, so she knows. There are 2 kinds of writers. There are planners and there are pantsers. And pantsers write by the seat of their pants. Because I am writing historical fiction, I have an outline because it's what happened. And that's what I do first. I do the research to find out what actually happened. And that then I have to weave a story into it. And I have to make sure that the fictional story doesn't take over the history and that the history doesn't take over the fictional characters, that there is a balance so that neither gets lost and that the reader keeps reading. And that's a challenge where I do not know what's going to happen. It's like I'm reading the book while I'm writing it. But I will say, for those who have read The Bayman's Daughter, I can tell you the way it was supposed to end, which it didn't end that way. It was based on my husband and I met in 1980, and we went out to Montauk. And while we were there, there was an old man sitting on a bench, and he had a camera, and he asked to take our picture. And I was really nervous to give him my address, which I had to do in order to get the picture, because he was going to go home and develop it and mail it to me, because again, there was no internet. There's no way to get it other than him mailing it to me. Months later, I got a letter from Bill, and I still have that letter. I should have wrote that, but he sent me this letter and with the picture. And my idea was that Philip, who lives in 2012 and goes back in time to 1912 and then lives through history from there, that in 1980, he would be at Montauk with his camera because he's a photographer, and that his young parents would walk by and he would take their picture, and they not knowing that it's him, but him knowing that it's them.
Oh, wow.
The reason it didn't end that way is because it's called The Bayman's Daughter. And those of you, perhaps Rose, you'll remember, there was a time I wanted to change the name. And they were like, no, it's got to be The Bayman's Daughter.
Yeah.
Because as Philip became a bigger character, I wanted to maybe have a name that included both. But with it being The Bayman's Daughter, I thought the ending had to focus around Hannah, the Bayman's daughter, and not Philip. So that ending didn't work for the book. But that's what happens. And then, like I said, things happen there that I don't expect to happen in the story. And I'm like, oh, okay. So this is where it's going. All right.
So you are what's called a pantser. Is that what they call
That's
that?
right.
That's right.
But I do have history to guide me with an outline.
Laurie Jean Lemanuel is asking, why is time travel a major theme in your book?
Oh, it's not just in the Bayman's Daughter. I'm a genealogist also. And so I have gotten my family and my husband's family, both from Italy. If you're from England, first of all, everybody who is English says that they are a descendant of Charlemagne. All of that's already been done. You can find that tree anywhere you want in the world. My tree, I had to work hard to get through and find the information and send people to churches to take photographs from ancient books of baptisms and marriages and deaths and everything else to piece it all together. And I've gotten back to the 1600s on most, and some lines the 1300s. And I have not only found their names, I've tried to find their stories. I've tried to find out what was happening at the time. Why did they do what they did? Why did they die? Why, how did they live with so many babies dying one after another, and still, how do they keep their sanity and keep having children? There were just so many things that I think about, and I would love to go back and meet them. And I would also love to go forward and meet my descendants someday. So I have this feeling of trying to bend time so that there is some point where I can meet them. Maybe my books will be that. Maybe generations from now, my future generations will read my books and know who I was because of it. That is where that comes from. Like in the trilogy, the girl goes into a coma and lives through a previous life. When she wakes up, it's the third book. and she has total recall of being a wife and a mother, but she's 16 again, and that family's gone. And she has to, and her own family didn't know she was going to wake up. So there's a lot that she goes through emotionally at the beginning of the third book. And then she starts to realize that people in her current life were there before. They've all been reincarnated with her, and that she has a chance to do things differently this time. And there's a special ending that makes you really happy, but I can't tell you that.
Now,
If you
what
didn't
book
read.
is that,
But
Theresa?
you have to get through all three of the
Okay.
trilogy to get to the end of Reawakening,
So that's
and then you get
Reawakening.
payoff. But if you don't get to that, you don't get it. Yeah.
Now,
So
we have a question from Al Ayub. He said, how long did it take you to do your first book?
I started writing it around 2006, but I had young children at home still. I didn't know if I could write. I didn't know if it would be any good. And I was a stay-at-home mom, and I thought I'm supposed to be taking care of my children, doing things for them. And they'd go to school, and all day long I'd write, and they'd come home and I would have gotten, there's no dinner ready, there's nothing done, because I've been writing all day. And I said to my daughter, who was 15 at the time, I don't know if I can do this. It could all be a waste of time. I don't know if I should do this or not. And she said, well, then Mom, do it for me. And that meant a lot to me, because I was a stay-at-home mom, and I didn't feel like maybe they had something to be proud of me for, because I didn't have a high-powered job or anything. I wasn't, I was Girl Scout leader and I was PTA president, but nothing gets paid there. And so I did it for her, and I kept writing. I didn't publish the Tin Box Secret until 2015, when my son went to college. He graduated in 2014. So then I started sending it out to literary agents and got lots of rejections. And I'd had already written most of the Hope Chest by that time. I published it in 2015, then Hope Chest in 2016, Reawakening in 2017, and the Porcelain Doll in 2018. And then the Bayman's Daughter was the most difficult book I've ever written, because it involved real people, and I was keeping them as real people. And people like Rose sent me stories about what their family had lived through, and that helped a lot. It helped it make it real. There's one woman who sent me stories, and her father was Timber, the local cop, like Officer Joel, right? But before that, in like 1940s and 50s, and she had this story about him at night, when he would walk around to look at all the stores to make sure everybody was safe. He'd first go to a pet store on Railroad Avenue, where there was an ocelot, a wild cat, and he'd put a leash on the ocelot and walk it through town at night while he was checking on the stores. And I'm like, where does that happen? I mean, that's like crazy. So that has to be in the story. Someone else, well, the library has recordings from around 2010 of elderly residents telling stories that they remember, and that was invaluable. And those stories were woven in to the Bayman's Daughter. Wow. So it was a lot of research for that book. So that book took me at least 2 years to research while I was writing, and I would still discover new things and then have to add that in. But there's one scene in the story where these boys, I guess it's the late 40s, and they take some rope and tie it to an outhouse and to their truck, and they drag the outhouse off of its foundation and down Main Street. These men talked about this in 2010 that were recorded on this recording. So I said, well, I got to work that into the story too. So things like that just find their way woven into the storyline, because it makes it more real and more personal to Sable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's excellent. I mean, amazing that very, very interesting and cool for us here at the library that you took some things off of our shelves, some local history interviews that we had done several years ago, and kind of wove in those goings on into your book. That's really so meaningful for us on our end and also for our community that you took
Absolutely invaluable.
our local
Yeah.
history and wove
William Brady was one of the men that was interviewed, and he talked about when during the hurricane of 38, that at that point they lived in Bayport. They were about to move to Sayville that weekend, and no one knew that this hurricane was coming, and they got released from school, and he passed the crossing guard that was in front of what they called the German church, which was I think it's called St. John's. It's the Lutheran church, if I'm right. And the crossing guard told them, don't go home, go to your grandparents' house on Main Street. It's too far. You need to get home, get to someplace safe, get to your grandparents' house. So that happens in the story. Bill Brady talks about this, and it happens to him in the story.
Good
So
friend of my dad's.
yeah.
Yep. Mhm.
My neighbor is Mary Kennedy, and she is Bill Brady's sister.
Oh my God.
And she was married to Bob Kennedy, and Bob Kennedy was the grandson of Andrew Kennedy, who owned the Kensington Inn. And so again, she was valuable, telling me stories, showing me pictures of the family in front of the Kensington Inn. Of course, Connie Curry was a valuable resource about the Telefunken and other stories. There's just been, so the people at Meadowcroft gave me the docent guides. So I had all sorts of information, and took me on a tour, including the basement and including the servants' quarters that people don't usually see. And so it was really a wonderful community collaboration,
Yeah.
writing The Bayman's Daughter. But yeah.
It's a treasure.
Thank you.
We have a question from Lori Jean where she says, without spoiling the end of The Bayman's Daughter for those who have not yet finished it, why did you choose to have Hannah after the family history of Philip and Hannah's children?
Why did I choose to have Hannah after the history?
Oh, alter, excuse me, forgive me.
Oh, okay.
Why did you choose to have Hannah alter the family history of Philip and Hannah's children?
For a happy ending. You need a happy ending. It's gotta be all, there's gotta be a payoff at the end. You gotta cry and be happy. Or else it's not my book.
My son calls those the three hanky.
Yeah, that's what it is. If you're not crying because you're happy, then I didn't do my job.
So do all of your books have an ending that ends happily?
Oh yeah.
They all
But they go through a lot along the way.
It sounds like it, my goodness. Sure. That happiness does not come without a journey.
No.
That's
So,
right.
war is part of the story. It's not all of the story,
Yeah.
but it's more of, it's not, I mean, that what I read to you, that was what the soldiers went through. Absolutely. But it's the human side of it still. It's the human side of war that I put in to my stories. It's what I'm more interested in than the political reasons.
Yeah.
But it is interesting afterwards what happens, that, like for Regina Ports, that she never got to go home again because her land was given, the borders were rearranged, rewritten, and it was never the same. It was not her home anymore. In my story, the girls have a broken porcelain doll, and they take it with them throughout their lives, and it is a metaphor for them. Regina never brought her doll with her. It was broken, it was left behind, but she said that a cousin sent her a porcelain doll to America once, and she did get another one, but it wasn't the same one.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. So can you go through, give us all the titles of your books, if you would?
Sure. Okay, so we have The Tin Box Secret, which is the first book of the trilogy. Takes place in 1968 in Baldwin, where I grew up. Then there is The Hope Chest, which is the second book. And this book takes place during the Civil War and the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. And then Reawakening, the main character awakens from a coma, and then and you'll notice she's wearing this necklace, which she is given in this lifetime. How did that happen? Gotta read it to find out. And this is 1969, goes into the 70s. And then this is The Porcelain Doll, which is a standalone book. And this is basically World War II, and it's inspired by Regina Ports and another friend, Erica. In this story, Issy is 85, and she's telling the story to her granddaughter. And her granddaughter has just lost her fiance in a car crash in which she was driving. So the first line of the book is, "It is one thing to live with grief, it is quite another to live with guilt." And they are dealing with survivor's guilt, both the grandmother and the granddaughter. Okay. And then The Bayman's Daughter has been selling like crazy, which is I'm very thankful for. And this came out in 2021 in July, and it's sold about 700 copies in 4 months.
Wow.
And it's available at the Catbird Seat, and they're all available at Catbird Seat. They're all available on Amazon and on Kindle.
Excellent. So can you give us, for those of us in the audience that may be writers, some of us may be published, and there may be writers among us who have not written that first book yet. Do you have any advice for us on our journey?
I do. You know, my husband watches Howard Stern, and Howard Stern, I heard him say, content matters. He was talking about DJs, but it's the same thing. Content matters. The book, you have to write well, but you also have to have an audience. So it doesn't matter how well the book is written if there's no audience for it. And it doesn't matter if there's an audience if it's not well written. So both things have to happen. And the hardest part of the whole thing is marketing. And it just takes a long time. It's, you know, those people who write one book and become famous, they are very lucky. They know the right people. I don't know what happens. But for me, you know, I had a creative writing teacher in college who said, write for yourself, don't write to be published. And I really wanted to be published. I really wanted to be traditionally published. But the reason I wanted that was because I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted people to know and to say, Theresa Dodaro writes well. I read her books and I can't put them down. I love her writing. And because without that, it's like an actor without applause. You need feedback to know that you're appreciated, all of the work that you do, everything that you put into it. And I have gotten that from The Bayman's Daughter. So I don't feel that I need to be traditionally published anymore, because as a self-published author or indie published author, you can write when you want to write. There's no one telling you what you should write, how it should end, giving you deadlines. You decide. I also decide. I mean, I've been doing nonstop book club talks, which has been wonderful. They're all local. But I don't really want to travel. I don't want to be going across country to do speaking engagements. If I did become a traditionally published author and became New York Times best-selling author, I'd be required to do things. I like my life the way it is. So I get to write when I write, when I want to write, what I want to write, for the people I want to write for, and they're now reading it. And that readership is growing and growing and growing, so beyond Sabo. And I'm getting the acknowledgement that I needed and wanted. And so there's nothing else that I need.
Royalties are terrible, incidentally, for digitally published authors.
They're not
Give
worth it,
away
huh,
your-
Valerie?
No,
Yes.
they're terrible.
Yeah, for traditionally published authors, their royalties are terrible. They should sell many more copies. I'm friends with Lori Fabiano, who wrote Elizabeth Street, and she published it with CreateSpace at first, but she happened to know Oprah, and Oprah put it on her top 20 summer book read. And so she got picked up by a publisher, and she now sells hundreds of thousands of books. She makes $1 a book, but she sells hundreds of thousands of books. So, you know, maybe I make $4 or $5 on a book and I sell 700. That's pretty good. But normally I sell, you know, a couple hundred. So I really, if people enjoyed The Bayman's Daughter, I hope they will pick up my other books and read them, because they're good too.
I have to share something with you. Lori Jean says, because so many of the women in our family have moved away from Sable and out of Long Island, I will be sending 5 copies of The Bayman's Daughter across the country for the holidays so that they can remember why we are the friendliest town in America.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori Jean. Yes, and other people have told me they're doing the same, that for Christmas they're buying books for everybody in their family. And I hope that they all enjoy it and spread the word and it keeps going. That would be wonderful. I'm thinking about writing a prequel.
Great. Yes,
That would center around the Edwards homestead and be the original families, the Edwards and the Greens. And I found that a Green daughter married an Edwards son, and that's the family that lived in the Edwards homestead. And then their granddaughter was Clarissa Edwards, who in 1935 published a story about her family and the history of Sayville. So she in detail writes about both families. So I've got a lot to go on, a lot of research, and Roy from the Edwards homestead has said that he would give me a private tour. And so I'm doing the research now, and hopefully there will be another story, and it will again include fictional characters. I'm thinking maybe it might be from the perspective of a young man instead of a young girl. And so we'll see. And then they would eventually connect to Andrew Trumbull in The Bayman's Daughter, the fictional family.
Great.
Excellent. It sounds like there is another story being woven as we speak.
Yes, and whenever I do book talks in Bayport and Blue Point and Patchogue, they're like, well, what about us? Like, I included them. That weirdly, it's this whole area is one village at that time. So it will include them also.
But we're best.
That is great.
Thank you, Rose.
Anyone else have any questions for Theresa?
No, just keep going.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. You know, it's so important to take some time to highlight some of the local talent that we have. We did a
Yeah.
program with Valerie before too. I think it was over last summer. I think we had Theresa, Valerie, we had Antoinette Trulio Martin on that chat as well, and it was just so cool to see our, you know, three local authors that published all for different reasons, have different audiences, and Theresa just keeps coming back with novels and and stories, and it's just so great to hear the background, not only of our local history area, but the way Theresa also weaves in the human story to it, so it appeals to an even broader audience. You know, so I think that's one of the things I'm going to be watching as I read the Bayman's Daughter.
I will
Yeah.
also add that all of my books, there is an element of things I'm trying to heal in myself, or lessons I'm trying to learn, that sometimes are hard lessons to learn. And my characters deal with the same things. And through them, I work through my own things that I need to deal with. And I think that they're similar to what other people deal with. And so it's a connection between me and my readers when they have aha moments that are presented through the characters.
Yeah,
Very
that's the
fascinating.
blessing of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That you're working through your story while you're writing another one.
Mhm.
Right, yes.
I think
I mean, I was very ill in 2002, and I was on a respirator and in a coma. So I had strep in my blood system, and I was in a coma for a week, and they didn't know if I would live or not. And that was very, for me, it was right after 9/11, and there were parents who didn't get to go home to their children. And I felt like I didn't know why I got a second chance at life when they didn't.
Mm.
And so I had dealt with survivor's guilt myself. And so I wrote about that, through the coma, and through the in the middle of the trilogy, and then through the Porcelain Doll. And it was very cathartic for me to go through it all.
Mhm.
But there were two things I wanted to do when I woke up from the coma, and that was to finish raising my children and to write a novel, which I had always wanted to do.
Yeah.
So now I've written 5, and my kids are grown and on their own. So, as long as God keeps me here, I'll keep writing. We'll see.
Great. Great.
And there's rumors of a 6th novel, I hear.
There
Okay.
is, it's got to be even. You can't have just,
Terrific. Terrific. Well, are there any other questions out there as we just peek past the hour?
No.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say, Theresa, thank you so much for sharing so much background, both of your life, also of the local history that is so rich here in our area, and then, a bit of world history happening there. We've touched so many interesting topics in this chat. It's been such a privilege to speak with you this evening, and we just want to say from the library, thank you so much for sharing your story on so many levels with us
Thank you,
here. And
Jonathan.
thanks so much for sharing.
Now that you know what the stories are about, you can tell people when they come into the
That's
library.
exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan, for doing this too.
My pleasure. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
So thanks once again for joining us for our author chat with Theresa Dodaro, our local author, who's doing very well. And great shout out to Valerie Nefora and Antoinette Trulio Martin as well, our other local authors that we've featured here. Check out Theresa Dodaro's novels here at the library, and also at Catbird Seat in Sayville, and also on Amazon.com. Great. So if you have any questions after this interview, you can always reach me here at the library. I'm Jonathan. I'm the head of community outreach. And then I can always connect you with Theresa as well. And Theresa is a regular librry patron. She comes in and uses the library. So
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Great job, Theresa. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you. Bye.
thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
have a great evening, everyone. And thank you once again, Theresa.
Thank you.
Happy
Bye.
Thanksgiving all.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
You too.
Bye.
Have a great night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.